Yeah, Sherry, how are you? And I know you're excited about our guest.
I am. I am. She's such an interesting person, has done so many interesting things. Her name is Dr. Catherine Ramsland. And I met her through Tracy Ullman. She was on the show, The Serial Killer's Apprentice. And Dr. Ramsland happens to be the co-author of the book, The Serial Killer's Apprentice. So just a little bit about her. She's a forensic psychologist and she teaches that. She teaches behavioral criminology, and she has appeared as an expert and on criminal psychology on more than 250 documentaries and magazine shows. That's a lot, Catherine. A lot. Like you've got a few projects under your belt, but
Yes.
yeah. So one of the things that you're doing is one of your main focus is research, writing, teaching career, and your work with and uh, on extreme offenders.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I didn't aspire to be an expert on serial killers and mass murderers, but that's that's what happened along the way as I was doing a lot of writing and research in these cases. I ended up getting a gig on a website called the Crime Library, which then was bought by Court TV. So I was sort of writing the resource area for the Court TV website. And I got one case after another of serial killers and mass murderers. So that became my career. And then when I started teaching and researching, even more so.
Wow. And did you, so once it happened, what made you think that you really know this topic well? What kind of what book, what case kind of really opened your eyes to really want to learn more? Because if you don't continue to learn, you're not going to be great at your subject matter.
Right. And I had done this extensive project on mental health experts who had spent a lot of time with an extreme offender, going back a century to the very first criminal autobiographies that were done in France in the 1890s. So I had done a lot of research on these people, and then all of a sudden, I got the opportunity to do exactly the same thing with Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. And I was ready because I had these role models of people who had gone over and above the typical assessment approach to one of these killers to really sit with them week after week, learning, what was their developmental trajectory, what were their triggers, what were the things that they thought about their crimes. And so I had the opportunity to study that and then do it myself with Dennis Rader. We spent 5 years working on his autobiography.
And speaking of, you were the co-executive producer for the Wolf Entertainment A&E for that 4-part documentary.
Well, that came after the book. The book was first. Dennis Rader was a serial killer in Wichita, Kansas from 1974 to 1991. He was caught in 2004, so he got away with it for 30 years. He was had a family. He was the president of his church body. He was educated. He was all the things we don't typically think about from the formulas that we've formed about serial killers. He was really an outlier. He hadn't been abused. He hadn't had all the things that we come to expect. So he was an interesting study. And because he'd gotten away with it for 30 years as well, he was unusual in that respect. And he had studied other serial killers as role models. So we did the book and then did a 4-part documentary for A&E. And yes, I was an executive producer for that.
That's awesome. And again, I saw the story of that on one of the Netflix movies shows. It was a series for 2 years and then ended up in Atlanta. I can remember that series, but it did highlight at the beginning about the person from Kansas, and you just didn't think it was the serial killer. Wouldn't have not thought that at all.
No,
And
not at
and
all.
this is based on the new movie coming out, Boneyard. Same deal, that you never know who could be a serial killer. It's not like you can profile very well. Have you learned that in the process of like highlighting all these different serial killers? It's very difficult to identify a serial killer through just profiling, right?
Well, profiling is really based on crime scenes. It's not reading people. It's based on crime scene behavior, and you look at crime scenes and decide if several are linked to a single offender or a team of offenders. But to try to guess who might or might not be a serial killer, I'm constantly being told that I have an advantage because I study them so much, but that isn't true. I can be fooled. And I would never want to be in a position to believe I could always tell. You can't. I hear cops sometimes say you can tell by the look in their eyes. No, you can't. You really cannot do that. Only in retrospect can people start saying, oh, yeah, I should have known. Sometimes you'll see some indicators if they're psychopathic and they're aggressive and cruel, or there's something mentally unstable about them. Occasionally you can figure out that this person is probably violent or going to be violent in the future, but that's very difficult to tell. And certainly there are serial killers who pass as completely normal.
Well, you know, you are a forensic psychologist, and you would know. But I'm interested, you know, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Did you get involved in all this and then go back to school to become a forensic psychologist, or did you become a forensic psychologist and then it put you into where you're at now?
Well, actually, I'm a professor of forensic
Oh,
psychology. I'm
okay.
not a clinician. I don't have a
Okay.
private practice. I don't testify in court. These are things that you typically expect of a forensic psychologist. So I'm actually a professor. I went to school to learn more about the research in forensic psychology instead of the clinical angle. And so that's more of my expertise. And also, I'm a writer. I've published 73 books and hundreds of articles. Lots of this is devoted to these extreme offenders. Researching has made me an expert, not being a clinician. So there's a distinct difference. Many people don't see the see the reason why I make that distinction, but it is pretty important to understand that I'm not doing clinical work with these people. I'm doing research and then expressing what we can find from this research that will be helpful for clinicians, but I'm not one of the clinicians.
When you get, so I'm sure you get lots of calls when there's a potential serial killer on the list, right? To get your expertise and thoughts.
I get media calls. Yeah, police don't need to call me because they have the FBI.
Yeah.
That's really who the experts are. They don't need to call me. If they're in my local area, they might, but I don't typically get calls from law enforcement. I do police trainings. I do trainings for death investigators, but more often it's just media who call me about that.
So you have a fiction series that you've gotten information from, that you've learned from research. Tell us about that with the forensic psychologist.
Okay. Yeah, that I sort of bring together a lot of the stuff that I do, and my main character is very much me in a way, although I don't run a PI agency. So it's a female forensic psychologist named Annie Hunter. The third book is coming out in August. The first one is called Ice Cream Man, so like Ice Cream Man. And the next one is In the Damage Path, which is about a serial killer's accomplice, which I learned a lot from by talking to Wayne Henley for The Serial Killer's Apprentice. And then the third one also brings in a lot of the crimes that I've studied. I typically will use actual crimes for their cases. So it's a PI team. This forensic psychologist has a PI agency. It's a team based on people I've worked with as death investigators. I taught a class on the psychology of death investigation called psychological sleuthing. And so I wrap a lot of that up with real cases and put them into the novels to introduce people to things like I have a forensic meteorologist. Most people have never heard of that. There are forensic gemologists, people who look at jewelry to help identify dead John Does and Jane Does. There are my person is a suicidologist, as am I. So I try to use the fiction to introduce concepts that are in the real world of forensics.
So is this through a book, a series of books that you're
Yes, it's a
writing?
series of books. Yes.
And they've come out already. Some of them come out.
Two have come out already. The third one will come out in August, and the next one I'm already at work on. And it's a different way of approaching the kind of work I do, but using the work I do, because the cases that I write about are real, but I put twists in them and then put fictional characters in.
I was looking, she's really all the books. I'm on her Amazon now. Unbelievable. You're accomplished. What do you think makes you a great writer? You talk, with all the reviews and, the accolades as a writer. What makes you a great writer? Because again, you're very good at understanding and as a researcher. But because a lot of writers wonder what makes them tick? What makes them successful so people buy their books, write great reviews, all these different things. You have so many reviews. I'm looking at your Amazon page right now, author page, and what do you think it is?
Well, I know I've developed a reputation since for the last 25 years, actually, of being able to take complex scientific concepts and express them in a way that is very accessible to most readers. So, for example, I wrote a book called The Forensic Psychology of Criminal Minds, and that's based on the TV show. But what's really in the background of that? And I explain the concepts, I explain the development of the FBI profiling program. I talk about the things that you might see in that show. I did another one, Forensic Science of CSI, et cetera, et cetera. So I've developed a reputation for making difficult things very easy to understand in nonfiction. And as a result, I have, and people have seen me a lot on these documentaries. So as a result, I think they come to expect, oh, okay, she'll clarify this. She's researched this. She's spoken to serial killers and mass murderers. She will be able to translate this so that we understand and we don't have to work too hard at it, get it, and she'll explain it in a satisfying way.
And that's how you break it down for your students, I'm sure. And you probably instill a love or fascination for the subjects in them.
I hope so. That's certainly the aim. You never know how it's going to settle, but I do, students come back and tell me that it was inspiring. It was one of their favorite classes. They learned a lot. That some of them have gone on to be in this profession because, I find it fascinating. Every case is different. Every case requires, I think, really going into it in depth because people are unique. They think of bizarre things to do and in the crime world. And I'm always fascinated by how people got to be how they are and why they committed the crimes they did and what they think or feel about those crimes. And I'm never bored. I've been doing this for almost 3 decades and daily, and I'm never bored with it.
I'm one question is, when I look at, what you've accomplished, do you think now what all you learned, do you think it's hard to be a serial killer today compared to 20, 25 years ago or 30 years ago when you look at Ted Bundy, who never got caught the first couple of times, and some of these other people that walked among us? Have you seen, because of all the CSI and the ability to uncover cases much quicker, is there really less serial killers now than there were years before?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because a lot of it has to do with our law enforcement record keeping. There might have been serial killers we just didn't know about. Also, we're learning about more and more in other countries and in other historical periods. So it's hard to kind of do a comparative analysis. But the first question that you're asking about, how is it harder to be a serial killer, to get away with it? Women are actually better at it than men in terms of of endurance and staying out there for a longer period of time because they're much more subtle and tend to use things that are not going to be discovered. Males are often impulsive or anger driven or sexually motivated, so they'll make more mistakes. They'll be more visible in terms of their victimology. But also we have more CCTV and everybody's cameras all over the place. That's one thing. We have genetic genealogy that is closing a lot of cold cases now that we never thought would be closed. But so some of the technology we have is helping to diminish their prospects of continuing for a very long period of time. We still have serial killers, of course, and they're eligible to be called a serial killer with only 2 murders in 2 different incidents. So that put a lot more people onto the list than previously when it was at least 3 murders. Now it's only 2. So more people are eligible. But I'll say that, we have someone like Sam Little who kind of emerged a few years back, who had been killing for decades and getting away with it by choosing victims he knew were under the radar. He knew that law enforcement would not put much resources into investigating their deaths. They were often Black, drug users, prostitutes, or homeless, or hitchhikers, or something that he knew was just not going to command a lot of attention. And so he traveled around the country a lot. So he was able to get away with it, and he claims 93 victims. So that's a lot of victims over the course of a number of decades, and he was only recently caught. So how many others might there be like him? We don't know.
Wow. You have through your years of experience, and you've come up and you've coined some concepts like MURDAR, MUR-DAR, temporary psychopath. How did you come up with these and how did they catch on?
Well, I will say that the MURDAR idea was kind of something that I was doing or coining with a former FBI profiler, Greg McCrary, where I was writing a piece on couples and team killers. And that concept emerged. It was like the idea of gaydar or radar, somebody who has an eye for the kind of person who would be vulnerable enough to be a partner. So we think of them having an eye for victims, but they also have an eye for the kind of person who could be leveraged into a compliant partner. So that's what the MURDAR is about, which brings me to the term temporary psychopath, because in the Serial Killer's Apprentice, I talk about these teenagers who are vulnerable because they either need money or they're into substance abuse. They're looking for excitement. They fall in love. There's all kinds of reasons why they're vulnerable. And the predator, the adult predator, figures out ways to twist them and pull them in and create an environment where they can act in psychopathic ways that are uncharacteristic of them. But under the predator's influence, they can continue to act and look like psychopaths. But once the predator is out of the picture, like after an arrest, or in Wayne Henley's case, he killed the predator to end it, they revert back to the kind of person they were before. So in that temporary phase, under the influence of somebody who had twisted them into this particular position, they were temporary psychopaths or situational psychopaths. It's another way of understanding it. And that concept was really not out there. That was something that I coined by looking at a lot of these team offenders and team killers, and also hearing what they had to say once they were out of the relationship. Many of them would say, "Oh my God, I can't believe I did any of those things. I don't know how I was able to do it." And so I studied that. I was really curious. How is a person like Wayne Henley wanted to be a minister? how is a kid like that, who is just a hippie, smoking dope kind of kid, how was he able to be recruited to be a co-killer and then ended up killing the predator? And since then, and he's been in prison 50 years, he's been fine. He's been a compassionate person. So what is it in that team environment that affects people, certain types of people, and especially teenagers, in a way that makes them behave uncharacteristically and look like psychopaths?
I guess
Um,
they sniff that vulnerability out, you know. Wow.
Yeah.
all right. So where is the best place we can find your latest book, and where can we go?
Well, I think the latest book, The Serial Killer's Apprentice, and also the book I did with Dennis Rader, Confession of a Serial Killer, can be found anywhere you find books, certainly online with Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but it's easily ordered as well. They're commercial books, so pretty accessible and available. They're also in audio form as well, an ebook.
Awesome. What recommendation would you make for somebody that wants to be an expert like you in this industry? What would you recommend them do?
Well, if they were looking at one of my books, I would say How to Catch a Killer is probably a good one, because that's 30 cases of how serial killers were caught, identified in certain categories. So getting familiar with cases, that's basically how I did it, is really learning as much as you can about those cases and about the investigations, and then forming some research questions for yourself that pull you into more. You want to make a contribution. You want to figure some things out that haven't been figured out, just like I did with the temporary psychopath. You want to be able to find these holes in the research and move forward and fill them. Obviously, you're going to need to be educated. So you would look for a program where you could study these things, especially study under a mentor, but keep forming a way to move yourself into the research so that eventually you would make a contribution.
All right. We appreciate it, Catherine. Thanks again.
Thank you, Catherine.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed this.
All right. That was a special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show and also Storehouse Media Group.